Episode 4 of our wonderful podcasty thingamabobber. um, I don't. I was gonna talk about other games today, but then maybe I was like, oh, maybe I'll do something else. I wrote a blog post and it's gonna be coming out soon. And this is it's the notion we've heard from a number of designers, like why a lot, especially in the indie space, like why don't people want to try our games? Why are they so stuck on D&D? And I actually answered a post like this on Twitter once, and the person was like, "You're wrong and dumb," and I'm just like, okay. That's why I don't really like to deal with Twitter very much. Um, it's like we're not very civil. People are not very civil on Twitter. But my point is, a lot of people always, especially in the TTRPG indie space, have inherent issues with, like, why aren't people playing our games, and why are we so beholden to Dungeons and Dragons, and why don't people ever want to try other things? And it's very frustrating. I understand from the designer perspective. It's like, how come we can't break in? How come nobody wants to give us a try? And the reality is that there's a number of factors, but I'm gonna break this down, and I'm gonna talk about this. And some people might disagree. A lot of people might just disagree. I venture to believe that people are gonna just massively disagree with me on these things, but there's a couple points I'm gonna bring up. Number one, TTRPG is not built. The way it's built as a game is not built for people to try new things. When you are first introduced into TTRPG, you join a group of friends. Most of us are. Most of us, other than the ones that show up at an eventually because we heard about D&D, most of us become friends with the people we play with. Like, we join a campaign. Usually what most of us are seeking is a campaign. And eventually, every player who plays enough is going to end up in a campaign at some point. And if your experiences are generally positive with this campaign, you're going to play it for a long period of time. It's ideally a couple months to a couple years, but it's going to become part of your social circle. And in TTRPG, this social circle becomes very much on point of, like, you know, what experiences you have initially with the industry, with the game world RPG. And if you really love this group, and if you really love your time there, you're going to have an affinity for the system you play, and it is a fact. So most of us start in D&D. And because we start in D&D, because we join these long campaigns, because we get ingrained into the same routine, it's very hard for people to change. We say, oh no, people, it's not that hard to change. Like, it is. Like, the reality is that most people don't like change. Most people prefer to eat at their favorite restaurant because they found something that they like. Why change? If you love your job, why change your job? Because don't you want to challenge yourself? The majority of people are not like that. The majority of people like to stick to what they know. The majority of people like to do a routine. The majority of people enjoy games that they're familiar with. And if you have really good memories of, say, playing Dungeons and Dragons, or you have very good memories playing, Call of Cthulhu, or you have Palladium memories, or you have, Universal System memories, or you have GURPS memories, or if that's your that's your enjoyment, that's where you started, and that's what makes you feel good when you think about TTRPG, because it's like, I was in this campaign 20 years ago, and it was my first one, and it was so amazing, everybody has a soft spot TTRPG. Like there's no such thing as like mostly everybody. I don't want to say everybody, but mostly everybody has like this soft spot TTRPG. And that's because we joined in these groups of friends, and it gives us these pleasurable memories, and it's hard for us to like break away from that. And a lot of us start to want to chase that again. So a lot of like, if you really like sit down with groups, a lot of people will recycle some characters or bring some characters back, or relive a campaign that they wrote for a group 20 years ago. That's because that to them was a special group, and it's something that they hold very dear, and they want to recreate that with a new group. And if you just listen to conversations, like literally listen to conversations, a lot of people create things that like worked in another campaign or in another group, or they talk about stories about other times they played, and a lot of times what they're doing is they want to chase those memories again, or they want to make the new group into the new thing that they love. But a lot of that is very system dependent, because they are comfortable. If you played 5 years in Dungeons and Dragons, and you had the best times of your life, what makes you want to change a year later? Like, what? Oh, because we have a game? Okay. But I already have all the books. I already have all the things I need to play the one game I do really well. So why do I want to change to your game? And that's an inherent problem, but that's a reality. Like, it's not something we want to admit, but it is just how market saturation works. And as much as we would love them to try our games, it's just that you get comfortable and people don't like to change. You might be a person that likes change. You might be a person that's sitting here going like, I love new games. I love to try everything. Why? But most people aren't like you. It's a fact. Most people like what they like. Most people don't want to spend their hard-earned time learning something that's just a hobby for them. For them, it's just a fun thing to do on a Friday night. For them, they're looking at a game going, that's just fun. I just want to play. Like, I don't want to learn a new game. It's it's not unlike a board game. Like, board games are built for us to try multiple new things because it's an intellectual challenge. And so we want to play multiple games, but there's a lot of people that just repeat the same board games over and over again because they want to be able to play the same game that they like and master the same game they like. It's the idea of mastering the thing you like. And so most people, TTRPG itself is inherently built to create a player who gets entrenched into a game that they like. It's just not, it's the way it is. If you play with your friends, you create great memories. You do it how it's supposed to be done with a good GM, and you just become entrenched. And that's why people are very stuck on the thing that they like. And that's just one reason. I'm not going to say it's the only reason. I'm saying that that's just a reason for why people don't like to change. And the second thing, and this is another thing I've noticed in the indie and TTRPG space, is that we do a game, a new game comes out, and then we never hear about it after the Kickstarter. Like, oh, we made the game, and it's out. And then it's like, whatever happened to that game? And only fans really keep games alive. So, like, there's a lot of indie games that, like, raise a lot of money, and then that's it. There's no expansion to it. There's no desire to build a community. You don't really hear about it enough. You hear about people trying to continue selling it, but, like, once we do the work of trying to get it up and running, most times you just see it disappear. And that's problematic onto its own self. You have to imagine Dungeons and Dragons was around for 30 years, and they made multiple editions, and they had multiple attempts to practice and try things, and they created adventure leagues, and they tried card systems, and they tried this, and they tried that, and they tried this, and then all of the other creators started creating supplements for it because that's where the money was. So they started making, and so D&D ties up a lot of the great writers to add things that might not be canon, but make people want to, buy stuff and spend their hard-earned money on. And as a result, like it's inherently, if you're just one writer in a stream against hundreds of D&D writers, you're not, if you sort of just write a game and then go, okay, we're done, that's as far as your game's gonna get. I'm sorry, it's not mean to say, I'm not trying to be mean about it, I'm just pointing out that this is the reality that we face as designers. If you really like a game, you have to build a community behind it. You have to get people involved into it. You're gonna have to run a business to get people entrenched into it. You gotta get people to be incentivized. You gotta, you have to get people to GMs to run your campaigns. You have to get people to try your games, and that's offering a free game here and there is great, but that's not enough. It's a business, and trying to change a consumer's mind is what most businesses have to spend their existence trying to do. And we want to treat TTRPG as an art, not a business. But even artists have to operate like a business. You might be like, why? What do you know? It's like, well, I was a theater artist. I know full well because I have an audience that, you try to drag an audience into your show because, if you're nobody, then they're going to not want to show up. So my point being is that it's a business, and we have to run it like a business. And it's interesting how there's a lot of anarchs, a socialist movement in TTRPG, which is fine, but like it's still, we're operating in a capitalist system, and I hate to be that, but it's like this is what we're playing. This is the rule book that we're playing with, and we have to just do the best we can out of it. And what we'd love is that it would just be, collective art, and we create games and people will play games because we want to all try games, but that's just not the way it works. There are players in the market that have more money than us, and they use that money to release new products and to build inherent audiences and to incentivize people to continue to buy their stuff. And they can lock up all of the writers because their product is bigger than ours. So you have to grind to make your game into something. And I'm not saying like my stuff is successful. I am not saying that, but I'm fully aware like this is the reason I'm not doing as well. Like it's going to take me, if I find that there's a game that we're going to be building, we're going to build a structure around it. We're going to try to get people interested in it, and we're going to get people to get involved in it. And that's the overarching goal of what we're trying to do. But if we don't, then, D&D's got 20, 30, 40 years ahead of us. Nearly, 30. Probably closer to getting to 40 years. You've been designing for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. Maybe more. But if you've been designing, you can't just go, well, you should just give us a chance. It just doesn't work that way. You have to grind. Everything is grinding for it. And if you really want it to happen, that's the way it has to happen. If you want to prove that your system is better or your system is the thing you should use, then yeah, that's what this requires. And I don't want to be the person to tell you, I'm not trying to say your stuff isn't good, because I imagine your product is very good. But the reality is that the Twitter sphere that we're operating in is mostly other designers, And the best thing to do is you have to go out into the world and you have to persuade consumers that your stuff is the thing that they need to buy. That's the tough part. It's a business, and you can't just be a game designer in a bubble. You have to be a game designer that runs a business. And if you want your games to succeed. Because most of what we end up with in TTRPG for our Kickstarters and our successes is other designers supporting you and elevating you because they're your friends, which is great. But the reason that we don't get to penetrate market is because we don't have enough outside of that. And that's the hard part. And it might just be that there isn't enough, maybe there's not enough podcasts that talk about RPGs, or maybe it's just that there's too many APs that are centered on D&D, and then the saturation out there is on that too, so it's very hard for us to get word about other stuff out there. It's a number of factors, but we can't just sit here and say like, oh, the guy who has 30 years ahead of us, well, it's unfair. And I'm like, well, they've had 30 years, and D&D's almost gone bankrupt and almost been destroyed. So it's not like they haven't been close to ruin themselves. They just have had time to perfect how they do things. And it's a slow but gradual grind. So that's another reason. It's business. I hate to say it that way, but it is. And the third thing that I think is the reason that new people don't want to try our games is that, how do I put this? I have a third reason. I don't know if I have a third reason. No. The third reason is that it's what I was saying earlier, is that D&D has got all the content creators on it. You have most of us, there isn't an indie league of writers working to try to best D&D. Imagine if the best indie writers got together into a room and decided we're going to create a system that's going to fight D&D, and decided we're going to do it, and gosh darn it, that could happen. That could be the thing that breaks it. Because the thing about it is that D&D has all these writers that are making adventures, and they have all these writers that are making like supplements, and you just see it all over Twitter, over YouTube, just all these different supplements, and they're great stuff. And because of that, it's like they're a force of writers, because the more people make these supplements, the more people have their eyes on D&D, and these supplements may not be canon to D&D, but there's still people naturally promoting their supplement, which naturally promotes Dungeons and Dragons. It's a secondary or tertiary promotion system, which is great, and that's how they sell. They use the D&D coattails to make themselves sell more, and it works. The problem is that we in the indie spaces who make indie games are one or two or maybe three or four writers, and we're interspersed, and we're all in our own individual corners, and there's no standard of writing. There's nobody who's like trying to create something to challenge that. We're all in our own corners. We're all fighting our own thing, and we're all fighting for the limited amount of dollars that exist. Because if D&D gets to take 75% of the dollars, then we have to scrap over the 25% that's left, and that makes us more enemies than friends, and that's problematic too. There's no RPG coordination. We all just release when we're going to release. There's no building. There's no connectivity. It's a small shop of 3 or 4 people, or however many people, versus hundreds, and that's not a fight that's very easy to win. So the fact that we're Indie's interspersed, Indie's broken up into freeform and OSR. Indie's not a unified front. That's what makes it very difficult to fight against something that's so much stronger. It's natural. If some of the best writers decided to come together and combine to make a project that was intended to challenge Dungeons and Dragons and to put real money behind it, I think it could be done. I think the only reason that nobody has is because nobody wants to make that challenge. And you might say, like, oh, what about Paizo? Like, that's D&D 3.5. It was. I don't know what the version 2 is now, but they're challenging, but they lost a lot of ground. And ever since 5e came out, they've just lost ground. It's not Paizo. Paizo used to be where I went to Paizo after 4e myself, but I'm not a fan. I mean, it's sort of lost its ground, and it's because the machine that's Dungeons and Dragons is churning out at a rapid pace, and that's my point, is that you can't. If something is refreshing and bringing new content all the time, how are you ever supposed to combat that when you release one game every 6 months to a year, or every 2 years, or however long it is for you to make your process? It's not something that we can ever combat. The individual states of indie TTRPG is probably as strong, or if not stronger, than the D&D stuff if we ever combined, but we're not, and that's never going to happen because we're all designing our own things, and as a result of it, it's easy for D&D to just divide all of us and conquer, and that's okay, but that's just the reality. If we pulled our resources into framework, it might be a lot better, but how do you create that, and how do you determine what that means? If the best writers, if the best writers and the best of our industry in indie TTRPG combined together to create something, it couldn't be stopped. I firmly believe that, because the skill of writing, the skill of grinding it out ourselves, the skill of trying to make a system from scratch, has given us an interesting perspective in TTRPG. But because we all act independently, it is very hard. It is very hard for us to be able to smash something that is so much larger than all of us. I've always just said to someone, give me a bunch of money, let me go buy Paizo, and let me make Paizo the Android of TTRPG. Let D&D be the Apple of TTRPG. Let's let Paizo be the Android of TTRPG. Let it be an open source thing with community driven decisions on what becomes canon. Let it be driven by the free market and by the community. And it's far more interesting than you do your thing and you do your thing and the content creators just make everything. It's more interesting that you can, an open market can determine the future of a game. But that's what I would say would be the thing that would be more interesting, is that we have an Apple in our midst. We just don't have an Android. And I think that's also the problem with collectible card games like Magic. Magic is Apple. There isn't an Android to challenge it. There isn't an Android to say, hey, here's a way to beat Magic. It's not possible. And it's because we don't have a counter. And unless somebody wants to come up and counter, it's always going to be a long road. And that's my take, my hot take. Potentially, I think it's a hot take on why I think it's hard for us to, as indie designers, to break in against Dungeons and Dragons, and why people don't want to really give us a chance. To reiterate and recap, 1, TTRPG is built for people to become entrenched into games because it's a natural thing. When you play a game for long periods of time, you get comfortable with what you know. 2, the major issue is that, it is a business, and Dungeons & Dragons is so much bigger than us, and we need to continue to grind it out and build community, and that can be very difficult, especially with limited resources. And 3, we are all separated as indie RPG designers, and it's very difficult for us to compete when we are all in our own sort of individual corners. So this is just the reality of things. And so I'm not saying that no indie RPGs are successful. I'm saying that like the success of D&D is just that much more of an eclipse comparatively to others. Anyways, that was my hot take. I hope you enjoyed my little rant here. It was something different. I'm gonna go back to talking about game design stuff next week. This was a wonderful, what do you call that, episode, talking with y'all. If you like my meanderings, please hit like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.